It's time for another edition of Raising Financially Fit Families with Joline Godfrey podcast. I'm your podcast producer, RJ Malik. And Joline, it's good to see you as always. You've got another great podcast lined up and another guest. So what I'm going to do is let you take it away from here so you can introduce what you're going to be talking about and introduce your guest.
Marvelous. Well, this morning, RJ, I have a friend and colleague with me, Josh Gentine. And Josh, I think you and I have had very easy conversations. So this morning, I want to throw out as a starting place the topic of strengths in families. But before we do that, I want you to tell your listeners a little bit about what you do and who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Joline. Thanks for having me on this. A little bit about me and what I do. I think the background provides a nice platform for talking about what I do. My work is entirely informed by my own experience. So I grew up influenced, not in necessarily influenced by our family business, which is Sargento Foods. And I talk about the fact that I literally played hide and go seek in the factory when I was growing up, and it was a part of our DNA. And big employer, small community. It was what I knew, and really, Joline thought that I was going to be a part of that business. We had very clear guardrails and a family participation plan, which dictated how, if we were going to be involved in the business, what would that look like, and how do we get involved? And so I followed the path, and frankly, got a lot of pressure from my dad to do just that. An inordinate amount of pressure, I might say, to follow that path. And did the right things, studied finance, got involved in food and beverage after undergrad, but was also thinking about being a Catholic priest, and was really at a crossroads as I was going through board interviews and trying to figure out where do I fit, where do I belong, and what do I really want for myself, and where am I being called? So I felt like I needed to honor this question that I had in the back of my head since I was 13 of the seminary. And so I decided to apply to the seminary at Notre Dame, where I did undergrad. And I think we've talked about this, but it's a running joke. I didn't get in the first time, which is a really lousy day. And decided, all right, I didn't get it. I'd been dating somebody. They said, we don't want to be a rebound. So I ended up getting my MBA, which was a requirement if I ever came back to the family business. So got the MBA, then went back to Notre Dame to be a priest. And after a year at the seminary, realized this is not where I'm being called. So I ended up calling Deloitte Consulting and did global M&A for about 4 years with them. Loved the experience. Also came to recognize that I didn't want to be a part of the leadership group at Sargento, at least on a day-to-day basis. So after spending time with Deloitte, I started coaching individuals and families. I joined the board of directors at Sargento and started working with families full time. And so, Joline, all my work now is spent helping families navigate the challenges of being family with their assets. And I talk about enterprising families. These are families that have family offices. They're thinking about a family office. They've got an operating company, and they're trying to figure out how do we be with our assets, and how do we make sure that the blessings that we have as a family don't end up becoming the demise of the family. And it's the soft stuff, but oftentimes that's the hard stuff when navigating wealth. So that's what I get to do every day. And I joke that I'm probably 70% pastor at this point and 30% strategist, because more often than not, I lean on the pastoral skills more than I do my strategic skills. But that's what families need. So
no, I think one of the reasons I have felt such kindred spiritness with you is even going back to the story of big company, small town. I mean, I grew up in a commercial dairy. It was the same scene. I wasn't under pressure you were, because I was the girl and my younger brother was the one with the expectations.
There it is. That's right.
It was the day gender ruled fairly often in those days. But I do think that experience informs you, no matter what ends up happening later on, as you describe. And I think for me, and sounds like for you as well, it really impressed upon me the power of community,
Mm,
both the larger community and I think family is community. And
yeah.
so one of the things I wonder if you talk about a little bit is this duality of in a family, there is the concerns of each individual, their autonomy, their agency, all of those things. But then there is well, how do we make it all work with everybody else?
Mhm.
I suspect that's a big part of your work now, that managing that dynamic between the individual and the larger group, if you will. Can you
Yes.
talk about that at all?
Yeah, it's one of my first slides whenever I'm working with a family and I have a family meeting is I do use the analogy of the tree, but I look at the fact that more often than not in sort of enterprising families, they've done a lot of work on sort of the returns, the fruit of the tree, right? And that's what's most visible. And so there's a lot of time and attention spent on estate planning and investment decisions and the legal side of all of it. And very little dialogue and intentionality has been spent at what I consider the roots, which are the individuals. And if we think about this tree analogy, the roots being the individuals, the trunk being the family system, um, if the roots are not healthy, it's hard for a tree to be healthy. It's hard for the fruits of that labor to actually manifest. And so, yes, I spend an awful lot of time helping families navigate the dichotomy of these individuals, and they all have unique interests, desires, motivations, and yet you have to work together as a system. And I think families, by and large, in my experience, and maybe it's because I've been self-selected in, right, because of the work that I'm doing, but I think by and large, families are not necessarily great communicators. And we take family for granted. And that that dynamic of just assuming we know who somebody is because we've lived with them misses a lot of the nuance that goes on in our minds and in our hearts. And part of the work that we do in almost every engagement that we have with a family is we spend time doing personality assessments. We do debriefs on those personality assessments. We do one-on-one interviews with all the family members to understand, who is this person? What makes them tick? And then we bring everybody together in a family meeting and we go through a giant personality workshop with a family, just like you would do in any corporation. And
Sure.
this is what I think is always fascinating is companies spend billions, literally billions of dollars helping colleagues learn how to deal with one another and have crucial conversations and get to know each other at a deeper level. But we don't do that in families. And when kids go off to school, college, university, they evolve so much and their interests change. And unless moms and dads and family members are sitting down and have a deep sense of curiosity about who that person is becoming through that experience, they miss a lot. And so one of the joys of the work that we do is walking and guiding families through that, because once they know one another at a deeper level, they can understand the why behind decisions. They can understand where they're coming from, and that provides the glue that allows the family to begin to align on decisions going forward. And it may not mean everybody is in agreement around something, but at least they understand the why behind it. And more often than not, that's the challenge, especially in family offices. Is it's not the investment decisions; it's understanding one another and helping navigate that.
So well said. I talked to Paul Sullivan not too long ago. He used to write the Wealth Matters column for the New York Times, of course, and now he's running Company of Dads, which is a terrific company. And he said, particularly organizations love buying things. They'll buy a great software program, They'll put a great program in place. They'll buy a lot of things to make stuff work, but they don't invest in communication, which is what you have just described so well. And that's exactly right. And fundamentally, if you don't communicate, I don't care what else you buy, none of it really matters particularly. But the parallel to that I've been thinking a lot about lately is, in addition to putting money into all the things corporations do, they also invest in innovation. It's the lifeblood of a big company. I have realized for a while that you don't even talk about innovation in families because families want things to be stable. They don't actually want change. So, this paradox is you need to change in order to adapt in the family, and yet you desperately want stability. And so, this tension between change and stability, I think, gets in the way of our letting families breathe and grow. And I think that is a chronic problem in the work
Mhm.
we do with families. Um, Easing their anxiety so they can innovate and change is very tough. How do you approach that? I think your system of a deep dive into individual family members has got to be a huge part of the recipe. But what are some of the variables that make it work for some families and not so much for others?
Yeah, I think, I look back at some of Tony Robbins' work, right? And that is predicated on all of the work that has come before him, but he talks a lot about, pain and pleasure and those different motivators. And if we think about why does a family member, what are their fears around change? What's at the heart of that? And it's a story that they're telling themselves. It's a picture, a narrative that they have scripted for how something is supposed to be. And I think in understanding, asking the question and trying to understand what is somebody's story that they're telling themselves. Like, what do you believe, family member? Why do you believe it? Tell me about the vision that you have. And if we think about it, we all have some sort of vision of what family is and is supposed to be. And, when two people come together and they decide to get married, they're both bringing in a completely different and unique story that's predicated on their own life experiences. And unless those narratives have been shared with one another, it's very difficult for couples to come together around what is the vision that they have for their own family going forward. And even if they have a sort of a shared story, we're all going to have nuances. But I think it's really, really important to mine for those stories and to understand where somebody is coming from. And if we can understand where someone is coming from, it's easier. This is going to kind of sound manipulative, but you can pull on different levers to help them navigate change and the insecurity that might come with it, whether that is control or a fear of the loss that may be associated with, moving in this direction versus that direction. So I think the biggest thing is just understanding those stories. From a culture perspective, family culture is so interesting. And some of the families that I have been so impressed with, one of the most common elements or features is a culture of curiosity.
Yeah.
And curiosity, I haven't done a ton of sort of writing or thinking on this, but in playing around with it a little bit, I look at curiosity and building a culture of curiosity. There's the curiosity in how do I work? How do I as a person think? And being curious about ourselves and how we're showing up and what does that mean? As well as a curiosity of how does everyone else show up? And how do they think and behave and what's driving their motivation? And if there is a shared sense of curiosity about one another and a sense of curiosity about who am I and why am I operating the way that I am, it unlocks a lot, and it's fuel for amazing conversations. And curiosity isn't a scary thing. It's a motivating thing. It's an exciting thing. And those families that have it really, I think, have much deeper, richer dialogue with one another. They are more self-aware of how they are showing up and the implications that has on other people. And I think that provides an incredible foundation for building healthy family dynamics and a healthy family system from one generation to the next, because that culture will live into the next generation if it is cultivated early on.
Wow. This happens with you and I all the time, Josh. I don't mean to get into a deep conversation with you, and then boom, we're right there. I mean, it's just something that's really cool. But one of the things surprisingly you reminded me of is the Robert Frost poem of The Hired Hand. There is this fabulous line that's like a worm in our brain, unfortunately, that goes, family is where you go. When you have to go there, they have to take you in. And I have always thought what a low bar that sets for family in our culture. And it's right there. I mean, every kid at some point learned the death of the hired hand in grade school. And that notion of what is family is very much a place where unconditional love is the expectation. It isn't actually there very often. But the fact is, culturally, we think families where you go, they have to just put up with whatever. And I think that is part of the stabilization notion in the culture, that we want family to be the safe place, the shelter. Things don't change very much. They stay the same and you can count on it. But that is the paradox of curiosity. If you're curious, you're going to shake things up because you're going to be asking questions all the time.
Yeah.
And so the tension that you remind me of, this stability because of unconditional acceptance, if you will, which is a great goal to strive for in many ways, is at odds with the learning culture or the culture of curiosity that you're describing. And I don't know that I have an answer right away either, but I do think what you're pushing on is an important area for every family to have a dialogue about within their own family. Where are we on the curiosity, don't ask any questions arc of the family dynamic?
Well, what's interesting, Joline, is this idea of like the how do I describe this? There's even though we're family, right? And you're in a family, there's a sense of, I'm not supposed to ask about this, or I'm not supposed to ask about that, or that's your life. And I think I haven't fully baked this thinking yet, Joline, but if I think about that, I think the leading generation, parents, being open, especially as your kids go off to college and so forth, and being open about what's happening in your life and being vulnerable about what's real versus trying to protect your kids from the reality of the things that you're going through is a really important dynamic, because vulnerability leads to deeper trust. Trust doesn't lead to vulnerability, right? And so I think parents being able to exhibit that emotional awareness and their ability to be curious with themselves and be able to articulate that is a really powerful thing for kids to see, and opens up much deeper dialogue as a family. And anyhow, it's just a thought that came to mind.
Yeah, no, I think we're poking on some important territory here, but you also opened for me this other topic I think we don't explore enough, and that is the one of, what does leadership mean in family? And I ask that question these days because there used to be no question about it, particularly for what, centuries, not even just decades. The patriarch was the leadership model. There was
Mhm.
one person in charge who set the stage for everything that was happened, and that was the last word. And in many ways, I say this as a feminist in love with
Mhm.
democracy. It's an extremely efficient, wonderful system to have one person just saying, this is it, fall in line, that's the story. And that's the way it was forever. And Lord knows there is still a lot of that left here and around the world. Um, but the internet changed that. The younger generations now assume they have voice because they can just text something or email something. And our shift as a globe, even from one person is the last word to everybody has a voice because they figure they can, um, has, I think, changed leadership in families without a conversation. So the movement from the autocrat in the family making all the decisions to, say, family councils, relatively new dynamic. Still, a lot of families don't have a council. They don't even really know what I'm referring to as I sit here. And yet, it's the beginning of a shift towards a more participatory form of organization or participation in family. But I don't think we're talking about, so what does that mean for how we raise or educate people in families for family leadership? Are you seeing any traces of that issue or dilemma?
Yeah, there is. I think the idea of a more collaborative or participative sort of dynamic is a really positive thing on a lot of levels, and um, I think you're right in terms of there hasn't been a conversation about it, and I think in a family, the idea of sitting down and talking about what does participation mean? What does engagement across the family look like and mean? And what are the guardrails around it? And I think the there's a balancing act between, hey, we want all of the voices, and what are the guardrails in place, and how are we analyzing those, and how are we taking that feedback to come up with solutions that work for as many as possible, if not everybody, in a way that is, let's call it inclusive. And I think leadership, this idea of leadership and great leaders develop others. Great leaders find a way of pulling out the best in people and finding what drives them, what motivates them, and how do we engage that. And so I think the great family leaders find a way to democratize with guardrails, because it can't just be an open democracy. That's not how decisions are going to ultimately get made, and it can't work that way. And so I think it's important for family leaders and senior family leaders to engage that next generation and talk about and ask them what matters, and it doesn't mean that their voice is the solution or what everyone is going to do, but recognizing what is driving them, what's motivating them, how do we incorporate that into our thinking, and also recognize that it doesn't necessarily mean that their decision is going to be is going to be final just because they have a voice in the room. That's not how it works. But I think being able to have literally that conversation and saying, listen, I want your input. I want to understand how you guys are thinking about things. We may not necessarily take your decision as sort of the final, but here's why, and here's where we're coming from, and here's like the second and sort of third order effects of these decisions and why we might be choosing what we are. But it doesn't mean that you can't be at the table.
Right, right. I don't know what the traditions are in Wisconsin. I can tell you growing up in Maine in a little town, I grew up used to town meetings, which were back in the day when I was little, um, pure democracy. That
Mm.
very much what you're talking about. Everybody showed up at the town hall and everybody had a voice. It was chaotic and for a little kid, terrifying. I grew up hating pure democracy. It's like, what? Uh, Representative democracy
That's
made a
right.
lot of sense to me.
Yes.
And I
Yes.
think that's what you're talking about. How do you, we're kind of backing into the topic of governance, which I didn't mean to get to this morning. But what we're talking about is finding a way for families to be civil and open and communicative with one another.
Yeah.
I think somehow by a couple of decades of people talking about governance in families, it feels a little much, and most families think, yeah, we're not quite that formal. We don't have to go there. But finding a way to talk, which you and I keep coming back to here,
Yeah.
um, is really the secret sauce of making it all work. I mean,
100%.
it's
100%. And this, everyone hates the word governance. Governance is a dirty word, and nobody knows what the hell it even means. What is governance, right? And especially, yeah, in a family, it's like, well, we can't, that formality that goes along with it. And gosh, I remember when I was at Deloitte, I was the governance guy and decision rights guy, and at the time, I thought it was mind-numbingly boring. But only to realize it was driving how Deloitte operates, right? And how decisions get made. And there is a unspoken decision rights in every family. And, it's a quasi racy model, but nobody's actually articulated it. And I think in not articulating it and being clear about how decisions get made, it can lead to a lot of inferences, and it can lead to a lot of confusion and frustration between different family members because it just, going back to it, hasn't been communicated. And I think as a family grows, I look at our family and the fact that we're now working on our fourth generation, and we've got 50, 60, 70 family members as a part of our family group. You need formality. A small startup can operate in a very different way and doesn't need as much controls as a Fortune 500 company. And so, same with a family. And so, I think it's really important for families as they become more and more enterprise families to get very clear about how you're going to operate and have the conversations around how decisions. And if we go back to the RACI model, somebody's going to recommend something, somebody's informing it, and somebody's, accountable to it, and so on and so forth. And that's it's important to articulate that and to understand what that model looks like.
yeah. In prepping for this conversation today, I know I said really what I wanted to talk about is how do you build on strengths in families? And I think we've come full circle in a way back to, oh, geez, maybe just finding ways to talk to one another is one of the biggest strengths families can indeed build on. But before we close, and I know that seeing RJ here is always a clue to me that I'm moving on too long. But again, that happens with you. I do want to raise one more topic. RJ, bear with me for a moment because I don't want to leave without Josh and I talking about this last one. Moving away a bit from a topic, I think that the one we just did, which I think is so critical, to another topic, which is this giant transfer of wealth that is unfolding in families right now. I want to talk about that because to some extent, it's why families call me. What do we do with young people in the family when money is coming at them in really gargantuan scale? How do we prepare them for that? And it's the question I want to ask for you. That is the cornerstone of my work. How do you help the next generation prepare for the complexity of abundance? And most families grow up, they're worrying about scarcity. The families you and I are working with are made anxious by abundance. And I'm curious what you're seeing now as the wealth transfer speed picks up, as the scale picks up. What are you seeing in terms of anxieties and worries in the families you're working with?
It's almost always, we don't want to ruin our kids. That is, I hear that so often. And it's a fear-based scarcity approach of like, okay, like what if we give them this, what's going to happen to them, without recognizing that if they do the right work, and it's not always going to be the case, but by and large, doing the right work, and I'll explain what I mean by that, but doing the right work, this isn't about ruining them. It's about empowering them and being able to fuel another generation of wealth and I'm perhaps more importantly, global impact. Because the reality is these families that are transferring this wealth in, and the incredible abundance, while there's a huge risk in the concentration of that, there's also the potential for significant impact if sort of directed appropriately. And so to get back to what I was just saying, though, in terms of doing right, I think there's a bifurcation between the human, social, emotional, and the structure. So I think families that are able to have conversations about values, to have conversations about what does it mean to have this blessing and what do we do with it and why is it important, though that needs to take place, and appropriate governance around that wealth also needs to take place. And I would say that the former is more important than the latter in some ways, because you can put all the governance in place around that wealth, but if you haven't had that conversation about values and what's important in the meaning, it's not going to stick. So both need to go hand in hand. And I think families, by and large, spend a majority of their time on the governance of that wealth and not the conversations about that wealth, because it's scary.
Well said. Yeah. No. And I know I can feel RJ right there over my shoulder, figuratively speaking.
No.
But just to finish, one of the things, of course, I'm focused on is this getting to kids earlier and earlier. So those values conversations are organically woven into the family in such a way that it has staying power over the arc of the family's life from generation to generation. I just want to thank you, Josh, as ever. And I had said to Laura, it's just easy. We talk easily every time we do.
I agree.
So I want to thank you for the conversation today. I think we'll both take things from this to build on in the coming weeks. So RJ, you can interrupt us now.
Okay.
I'm resentful for sure.
Well, before we go, Josh, contact information, if you don't mind sharing it.
Yeah, it's J Gentine at benchconsulting.com. My work is just benchconsulting.com. You can find me there.
All right, excellent. Joline, your contact info.
And you can find me at www.bounce-10.com. And I look forward to having people hear this particular podcast. It was a good one.
Thanks, Joline.
Yeah, it was a fascinating conversation between the both of you. It was a pleasure eavesdropping. And Joline, I'm looking forward to your next podcast. And thank you for listening to today's Raising Financially Fit Families with Joline Godfrey podcast. Please like, follow, and share this podcast with friends and family. Until our next podcast, for Joline Godfrey, I'm RJ Malik.
Thank you for listening to Raising Financially Fit Families with Joline Godfrey. To learn more, visit www.bounce-10.com, and don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Bounce 10. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional therapeutic advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or qualified therapeutic providers with any questions you have regarding investments or therapy.